Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, Yarby Laws, and this is my co-host.
For Wells.
We appreciate all the support in our recent content, and before we do get started, please don't forget to like and subscribe and follow us on Instagram and TikTok at the OBT Podcast for more content and updates.
Yeah, so we did something a little bit different this time around. We recorded on a Saturday, and it actually ended up working out for us because we were able to follow the end of the Knicks Celtics series with the Knicks winning on Friday, eliminating the Boston Celtics 121, or excuse me, that was the wrong game. My bad. The 119 to 81. And this one was not very close, aside from, I guess, the first quarter, I suppose. And then the second quarter, the Knicks took the game over. Obviously, since the last time we recorded, right, you had the horrible Tatum injury, right, in game 4, where fourth quarter, believe the Knicks were up 9. Tatum, kind of falls and then tears his Achilles, right? And so that one's pretty bad just from the perspective of, I guess we can start off, I suppose, with the Celtics, even though I know we usually kind of start with the winning team. But obviously for them, this puts their window in a completely different situation, right? Because obviously we knew going into the season and going into this series, going into the playoffs, right, that there was a possibility that they were probably going to have to move some of their guys and probably shave some salary because we know their payroll was going to be $500 million or so because of the repeater tax and the second apron and everything tied to that, right? So we figured that this team was probably going to look different, but now it's going to look even more different, right? Because not only are they probably going to move at least one, if not more, of some of these other guys, they're also going to be without Tatum, right, for most, if not all, of next season. I know he got his Achilles surgery immediately after, if I'm not mistaken, right? So he got it pretty much as soon as possible. That's supposed to, I guess, not a doctor, but from what they were saying, it sounded like that it's supposed to kind of ensure the quickest, best type of recovery, right? If you do it as soon as you can, as opposed to just kind of waiting it out, right? So obviously that puts the Celtics in a completely different situation where we don't know what their team is going to look like going forward. The window for this group probably closed, right? So whenever Tatum comes back, right? Maybe again, who knows? 8 months from now, year from now, regardless, right? This team is going to probably be in a different spot. I'm going to assume at the very least Tatum and Brown probably still be around, but how many other guys can you really bank on being here, next season? I don't know, because chances are at least one of Holiday or Porzingis probably gets moved, right? Holiday, his age, Porzingis is in the last year of his deal, and unfortunately just wasn't able to really give him much this postseason, right? Because of injuries, illness. So a lot of stuff going on for them to have to kind of figure out, but pretty obviously tough way to go out. And, the streak continues of no back-to-back champions. I think it's the 7th straight season. And, we kind of saw why, right? It's kind of continued, right? Because even going into the postseason, we know the Celtics were a little bit banged up, right? We know Brown had his knee. Porzingis had his stuff going on. But regardless, most people still pick the Celtics, myself included, to win this series and potentially go on to win it all, right? So that ended up being wrong. So you give credit to the Knicks for being a different team than I think we saw for most of the regular season. And we'll get into that, but first kind of just attack it from the Celtics angle.
Yeah, it really sucks. I think, no matter who you really support, like you and I are not even close to Celtics fans, but I think this is probably the worst way and worst possible outcome for them, to lose to the Knicks in a 7-game series, before even getting to the Eastern Conference Finals. I think that hurts as well. But to also lose Jason Tatum for, a good portion of next year, that really is going to sting, especially when, you're vying for championships. A lot of people considered, I guess, this team to be the next dynasty or whatever. I thought they were a super team last year, but, they didn't really live up to the expectation. And like you said, you credit New York for, winning those first 2 games, because without that, then they probably don't win the series. But at the end of the day, the Achilles injury, I think, is the main takeaway that I have from this series, because it's like, that's pretty much your season next year as well, because I don't really foresee them being able to, be as dominant without Tatum for a good portion of the year, if not the whole year. And I think, he needs to take a page out of Katie's book and don't rush it, because normally when players come back from injuries like that, they're never really, the same. They do have to modify their game, and, he might lose some explosiveness or whatever, but I feel like he should really just, take it as slow as possible, because I think, his career, it was going to be bright, and I think it still can be. He just needs to, take this time with the injury, like, super seriously and stuff like that. And I'm sure he will. But I think basketball fans around the world, they're just really sick about the injury. But, if you're the Celtics, definitely, like I said, worst possible outcome, because, you got outplayed in the first two games, kind of saw a little bit of a bounce back, energy from the team. There were some bright spots, but I don't know. I feel like once they went down, 0-2, the energy kind of just got sapped from them.
Yeah, Tatum, 27 years old, right? I believe since he's come into the league, pretty much played the most games in the league, right? Because
Very
pretty much
durable.
every season, yeah, pretty much every season he plays almost every game, right? I
Yeah.
believe, he missed for most of those seasons, not more than probably like 6 to 10 games, if that, right?
Right.
Like he's one of the most, and in the playoffs, right? Same thing. So obviously that's rough, right? Because like you said, now you're going into from here on out the unknown, right? Because he was pretty much getting ready to enter his prime. We know regular season wise, this was probably the best version of him that we had seen,
Yes.
right? I mean, we already knew he was at a superb all around game, right? But just some of the other stuff he was doing, like the passing, right, career high in assists per game this year. So a lot to like about that, but they're going to miss that, right? And you kind of saw it in that last game. I know they were able to win game 5, probably kind of on fumes. Maybe the Knicks didn't, you know, do what they were supposed to do, whatever. But, game 6 was kind of like, yeah, this is where you definitely obviously missed Tatum. And I mean, like, you also just didn't get enough from a lot of the other guys. But, from the Knicks perspective, right, this is kind of, at least for now, like kind of the best case scenario, right? Because it's funny because going into the season, right? We all like this Knicks roster. I know obviously you picked them to win the title, but I don't think, we really looked at the Knicks as like, in this third, fourth tier behind some of these other teams. Like a lot of people kind of felt like that they were probably like right behind Boston, right? Like even ahead of like Cleveland and some of the other teams that, made moves over the course of the offseason, right? And it's funny because during the regular season, defensively, they were kind of a mess for a decent chunk of the season, but it did get better as the season went on, right? I believe they finished 13th in defensive rating. I mean, I know the second half of their schedule was a little bit different, but clearly there was something there. And then also, like, you got Mitchell Robinson back, and, I think the question was how much could he realistically impact what the Knicks could do? And the answer is kind of a lot, right? Because it allowed them to play these double big lineups that were a real problem for Boston, right? Where they're big and they're able to get all these extra opportunities. They tried to foul him to keep him off the floor, but it's kind of hard to do that for them, for a decent chunk of it, right? So, with the Knicks, like it's kind of funny because they did everything. Obviously, you have the Tatum injury. I mean, the Knicks were up in that game, so they probably could have still closed it out. But you just never know, right? With Tatum having the games he had, maybe they come back and tie up the series. Who knows? But like you said, the 0-2 deficit was kind of the sign that this was probably not going to go great for Boston
Right.
because we talked about it that all the Knicks needed to do was win one of those next two games and they pretty much had it locked up, right? And they got blown out in game 3 and then game 4 was kind of a swing game, right? Where it was kind of like the first two games for Boston where they would lead by double digits for a decent chunk of it and then just not be able to close. So we talked about it from a Knicks perspective. You were able to do everything that you needed to do, right? Because when the games were close, the Knicks were more than likely going to win it out, right? Because offensively, it just felt like that they were, the better team on that end of the floor, right? Where like they knew what they wanted to do. They had a lot of different options, a little bit more variety offensively, but even defensively, right? Like that was something that in the regular season we didn't really see as much of in a lot of these matchups where they were getting ran off the floor by most of the teams that they played against, and we needed to see a little bit more of a tougher, more physical team than we saw in the regular season, like last year's Knicks team, right? Because, like, last year's Knicks team, we liked a lot. pretty high on, thought they were going to go to the conference finals, but then they had the injuries, right? So that's kind of the thing with the postseason is like, yeah, it's a war of attrition. You got to be healthy, but the Knicks were banged up, by the end of last year's postseason. Then they could have potentially matched up with, the Celtics last year. Probably weren't going to win it, but now with this team, right, you just have more talent. And you still are getting some good things defensively, like, say, OG Anunoby, right? Defensively doing great. Even Mikal Bridges, right? Kind of coming to the party where in the regular season, I think a lot of people, ourselves included, kind of felt like it was a little bit of a disappointment, right? But in the postseason, right, especially in this series, he's been very valuable. And even a guy like a Josh Hart, right? Same thing, which, we like him. We know what he can do, but just a lot of good from there. And then offensive rebounding, that's a big thing for them, too. They were good at that during the regular season, even when Mitchell Robinson wasn't out there, right? So that's something that carried in. You just kind of saw a lot of the bad version of Boston, right? Like from previous seasons where offensively it was kind of a lot of just, like just not a lot of composure, right? In the fourth quarter, kind of just a lot of poor shot selection, not really a great distribution, right? And it just didn't end up working out, right? So we'll see where they go from here, right? But from the Knicks' perspective, it couldn't have worked out probably much better because now you're in the conference finals and, you're not having to play Boston. You're not having to play the Cavs, right, who were considered significantly better regular season teams and stomped them in the regular season, right? They both teams won all the matchups. Now you're playing the Pacers, but the thing about the Pacers is the Pacers have been a lot better in the postseason, right, than I think maybe some people had expected, right? And for them, you know, we hadn't even talked about, I think the last time we recorded, that series was technically still going on, right? But now they face a Pacers team that dusted off the Cavs in 5 games, right? And the Cavs are another team where what are they going to do this summer, right? Like, because obviously they were a team that in the regular season looked like a real threat to win the title, right? But then in the playoffs, obviously they smoked the Miami Heat, right? But the Heat were not very good. But then you go into the Pacers series, we picked the Cavs in 6, and they lost. And not only did they lose, they lost in 5. And it was kind of for, it's not the same as Boston, right? But like, when you watch them in some of these games, right, there's just like something that's missing, right? There was like a lack of toughness. There was a lack of, the offense that we saw in the regular season from the Cavs didn't really happen, right? Like we talked about it going into the series, where for the Pacers, they were going to need to take away a lot of the easy offense for Cleveland, right? Like take away a lot of the paint touches, right? A lot of the easy baskets that their bigs can get, and kind of just turn it into, hey, Cavs, you got to try to outshoot us from 3, right? And that's going to be most of your offense. And for the Cavs, they shot very poorly over the course of that series, right? Now, there were injuries for them, right? Garland had his foot thing, missed a couple of games. And then I guess Mobley had an ankle injury where he didn't play in game 2. Mitchell, I guess by the end of it was hobbled, but still, it kind of felt pretty disappointing given what everybody thought of the Cavs over the course of the regular season. And then even some of their other guys where you're like, okay, if Garland doesn't play well, Ty Jerome's got us. No, he didn't. He was pretty awful for the entirety of the series. Don't know what happens with that situation. Just bad. And defensively, right? Like the Cavs on defense, right? They were a really good defensive team for most of the regular season, but something happened during the second half of the season where their defense kind of fell off a cliff somewhat, and they didn't look like the same team. And they still finished 64-18, but a lot of that work was, through the first half, right? But in the second half, it just didn't look the same. And that seems to be kind of a reoccurring theme where, like, a lot of the teams so far in the postseason played their best basketball closer to the end, like the Pacers, right? Like the Pacers were a team that started the year off not very good. I think 10-15 to begin the season, right? Then what did they finish for the rest of the way, right? Like 40-17 in the regular season, something like that, right? So just pretty rough, I would say, from Cleveland. My guess is they probably still end up running it back, right? But maybe some of the bench guys are shuffled in and out. I don't know. Because, I mean, realistically, what else can they really do? Like, they're going to be a second apron team because of all the contracts they have. So they can't really do a whole lot in terms of free agency. And in terms of trades, there's not really a whole lot they can do there either. So, I think probably the hope is continued internal improvement from the young guys, maybe hope for better health. But, for the Cavs, this is going to be a team that until, they have more postseason success, nobody's going to take them seriously, even if they win like 74 games. I mean, just because of the fact that in the playoffs, it just did not look the same as it did in the regular season. Like, even like I said, offensively, right? Like, the offensive distribution was pretty out of whack, right? Because you saw stretches where when they would kind of get good shots for like Mobley or even like a Jared Allen, right? Like, it was a lot tougher for the Pacers, but then that wasn't consistent enough, and it kind of ended up being a lot of Donovan Mitchell and a lot of Garland, where again, we know that those are their probably, their two best offensive players and they're creators, and the bigs are finishers. They don't really create a whole lot of their own offense aside from, I guess, quote unquote, in the post. But you just didn't get enough from really anybody consistently over the course of the series. It was kind of a bad sign that like it took some monster Donovan Mitchell games to just barely get him over the hump, right? Because that's usually not a good sign in a playoff series where if your best player has to score like 50 points or 40 plus points just to barely win a game, or you're still getting blown out. That's not good, right? And at least you could kind of understand the first couple of games without Garland, but once Mitchell kind of uh, fell off, right? And again, he was hobbled, but then it was just done because they had a good response in game 3. But game 4 was bad. To be down by 40 at halftime, like it feels like there's something missing from this Cavs team, and it kind of felt more reminiscent of the previous postseason trips. Even though I know that they had the injuries, but that still feels like not a huge reason to just get crushed in 5. I mean, yeah, the last game, game 5, right? They were up for the vast majority of the game, and what happened? Blew it again, right? And credit the Pacers for their depth, their relentlessness, and their defense. But, that's pretty brutal for the Cavs to go out this way.
Yeah, I don't even really know what to make of that whole situation. All I can really say is, I tip my hat to Indiana. They came and they showed up, prepared, and I think that's what it really came down to. They had a lot of depth pieces. They kind of psyched the Cavs out, I guess, in terms of, kind of forcing them to not really play their brand of basketball, which was so successful during the regular season, right? Like, you talked about it. It's not like, they passed the ball a ton, but when they did pass it a lot, they generated so many open looks, very similar to Boston, in terms of spot up, shots from everybody. But, I really don't even know, like I said, what to really say there because, Darius Garland was definitely hobbled, didn't have the explosiveness that he had in the regular season because of the toe injury. Not really sure what was going on with Mobley. Max Strus didn't show up. Too much of Donovan Mitchell, like you said. But Indiana, they're sneaky elite, and I think we talked about that going into the postseason, where we talked about the guys that they have on that team, playoff risers, certified pretty much now. Like a guy like Nebhard and what he's able to do on the defensive end, that scares the heck out of me. If I'm the Knicks, and we already know Tyrese Halliburton is the captain of that team, and he's their orchestrator on offense. And I feel like if he gets going and then everybody else gets going, they're definitely one of the more dangerous teams in the NBA. Definitely more slept on. You already have Siakam continue to sing his praises every time that we talk about Indiana because he's super underrated. But man, oh man, I feel like, yeah, like you said, if you're Cleveland, you're the number 1 seed in the Eastern Conference and you lose, to Indiana, I'd feel like you should really be ashamed. And I think they should rethink some things in terms of, their approach maybe. But realistically, I feel like it came down to they just didn't play their brand of basketball.
Yeah, and even defensively, right? Like there were possessions where you kind of saw some of the issues in terms of say that starting 5 with the wings, right? Because there were a lot of possessions sometimes where like say like a Max Strus was kind of forced, to be switched on to a guy like a Siakam, right? Or like a Miles Turner. And he's kind of a big physical guy. So there were some possessions early on where he could hold up, but not over the course of an entire series, right? Same thing with the guards. And all that. So just brutal. I mean, because that's kind of the thing where you wonder, like I said, where do they go from here? But like I said, I don't feel like there's a whole lot of a choice but to probably run it back unless, because the only way to get out of the second apron is you'd have to kind of probably break the team up somewhat, right? And it's like I don't think they're gonna move Mobley.
Mm-mm.
I don't think Mitchell's going anywhere, right? He just signed an extension unless he wants to go. But I mean, they did have a really good regular season. So we'll see what happens going on from there. But that's the question: is what can they realistically do to improve? Like I don't. I mean, aside from hoping that Mobley continues to get better, and then maybe hoping for better health. I mean, that's probably it. Because bench wise, I don't know. I mean, are any of those guys going to come back? I mean, some of those guys, like a Sam Merrill, might just be cheap, just because he's primarily a 3-point shooter. But like, are you bringing back Ty Jerome?
No,
Right?
no, I'm not.
So yeah, exactly.
I mean, that guy was
That
garbage in the playoffs, and that's all that really matters.
right. So and that's kind of the question, right? And for him, it's funny, right? Because in the regular season, right, he looked like he was playing so well that he might have priced himself out of what the Cavs could realistically get him, and then he has this postseason, and I mean, there's not a lot of teams with cap space, anyways, right? Like, I mean, it's like what, like Brooklyn and maybe a couple other teams that have space, but not enough to like give like a ton of money. But
Yeah.
it's like if you're any of those teams, are you going to spend like a decent amount of your cap on Ty Jerome? Like, probably not. So he could come back to Cleveland, but then it's like if he does, but then if he doesn't, you still need to find a backup point guard, right? Somewhere, some way, somehow. So maybe that's where like you elevate Greg Porter Jr. He's a young guy. Hopefully, maybe you hope he gets better. I don't know, but they have a couple of draft picks on that roster that maybe at some point could turn into rotation guys. Okoro, I mean, again, a couple seasons ago he was a starter, and then now he's kind of a bench guy, and it feels like defensively, right? You like that, but it's just offensively, he just seems like a zero, and that's kind of something that kind of hurts. And the DeAndre Hunter move, right? He hurt I think he dislocated his thumb in game one, right from the Matherin block. So maybe it was just bad luck, but I don't know. It still kind of feels like same old Cavs, right? Like would you put them in the fraud category, or do you kind of just think just chalk it up to bad luck?
Well, if I have Philly in the fraud category, then I have to have
Okay.
Cleveland in the fraud category. You know,
Oh,
you have a guy in Donovan Mitchell who hasn't sniffed the Eastern Conference Finals or the Western Conference Finals. He changed conferences and still hasn't been able to get, to that point, and that's the same as Embiid. So I kind of have to, put both those teams and lump them together. Very vastly different in terms of, I guess the regular season outcomes this year, but in terms of the end goal, I feel like they're just not there yet, and I don't know what you can really do. I think it probably does come down to experience, health as well, because this is what back-to-back seasons where some of their guys have just been out for
yeah,
a few games and
right,
very important pivotal games. Like game
right,
ones, game twos, and then closeout games. You're playing not even close to 100%. I feel like it's just a
right.
recipe
You're
for
right.
disaster. So
Yeah.
yeah, it comes down to health, which is somewhat out of your control, but the experience. What more can you really do? Like you talked about, their hands are pretty tied financially. Can't really upgrade. And yeah, I mean, you're kind of just stuck with the guys, and I know it's kind of crazy to say stuck with when you do have you know so many talented players, but it feels like a little bit of a burden if I'm going to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, and yeah, you're right, because like last year, right, they had the injuries in the playoffs, right, where like Jared Allen got hurt, then eventually Mitchell got hurt, and then in the regular season last year, right, they had long stretches where they had both Mobley and Garland out, right, because he had the jaw thing. So I mean, a lot of stuff that just consistently hasn't gone their way, but it just kind of a rough thing to see. But obviously after that, now we have at least our Eastern Conference Finals matchup set between the Knicks and the Pacers, right? The Knicks will have home court in this series. Obviously, the Pacers returned to the conference finals back-to-back years, right? When it got there last year. Knicks first time since I believe 2000, right? Obviously, the Knicks different look this year, right? Obviously, they got Towns, they got Mikal Bridges, right? And whereas with the Pacers, it's by and large pretty much the same group of guys from last year, right? Like maybe a couple of guys I think who didn't play and now they do play, right? Because they took some of the veteran free agent spots or whatnot. But what do we think about this matchup? Because the Pacers have continued to kind of defy odds, I guess, right? Where most people pick them to, well, I guess they were favored to beat the Bucks, but definitely most people picked them to beat Cleveland 100%. But now they're back here again, with a better look defensively compared to last year, right? While their offense is still really good, right? Like I know like last year they were one of like the two best offenses in the league. A little bit different, but still elite. And then, now they are much better defensively. But then the Knicks, right, come into this postseason where offensively, like we funny enough really haven't seen like long stretches of their best offensive work, in the postseason, right? Like even for a guy like Towns, right, most of his work was done inside the 3-point line, right, in that Celtics series, right, kind of attacking mismatches. And then obviously defensively, we've seen a much better version of the Knicks than we saw in the regular season. So, obviously, I guess the Knicks, they were your pick to win the title. So I'm going to assume that you're picking them to beat the Pacers, right? What is your pick for this series?
Yeah, it's kind of wild, you know.
Mhm.
I think this is one of the more competitive, or it's going to be, you know, one of the more competitive series that we're going to see in this postseason. I feel like
Mhm.
it's going to be a coin flip. If you want me to be honest, I know that probably doesn't instill a lot of confidence in my pick, but that's how much I respect Indiana. And I have respected them, throughout the postseason. So I'm gonna go Knicks in 7. I think the Pacers will give them probably their toughest matchup because I feel like with Detroit they just didn't have the experience. That was a very winnable series for Detroit, but it came down to late game execution. Boston, they kind of just didn't show up, and I feel like Indiana's been on a heater, and that is very dangerous. And New York has been on a heater as well.
Mhm.
But Indiana, they've got some freaking hoopers, man. Like I'm telling, the guy that scares me most on that team isn't even like one of their stars, really. It's Nebhard, if you want me to be
Mhm.
honest. I mean, I could break that down a little bit later, but um, yeah, I'm gonna pick the Knicks in 7 because I think they do have the offensive firepower to keep up with Indiana if it comes to that. And they do have also the defensive prowess that I think you somewhat expected going into the season, but we didn't see it in the regular season like you talked about, right? And that was kind of my logic behind picking this team to win the title. I love the wings. I love the fact that those guys can either swap from being offensive options, or they can just straight up be lockdown defenders night in night out. And you have, a guy like Brunson and you have Towns, running that 2-man game, which is super powerful. But I don't know. It's going to be a wild series because you also have to contain a guy like Halliburton. You have to contain a guy like Siakam alongside the other players, on that team as well, coming off the bench. So it's going to be I think it's going to be a dogfight series, but Knicks in 7 for
Mhm.
me.
Knicks in 7 too. I had thought
Okay,
about it,
cool.
coming off the game just from the perspective of, again, like you said, both teams are playing some of their best basketball of the season, but the
Yep,
Knicks I think can be even better
I agree.
offensively than what we saw. Obviously, Indiana's a different team defensively than Boston, right? Like they don't have like the quote unquote all NBA defensive personnel, right? Like say Boston has like guys like White and Holiday, but they still are a really good defensive team. They have a lot of guys that can, kind of pick you up full court, pressure you, kind of force you into making mistakes. You still have Turner who can protect the rim, right? Siakam's, like a long athletic guy. So they have a lot of good options there. They also have a lot of depth, right? I mean, like they're basically
Very.
playing like two full squads out there for most of these games, right? Because you have the starting five, like you said, with Halliburton and Nemhard, Neesmith, Siakam, Turner, and then you still have guys off the bench like McConnell, Obi Toppin, I mean, yeah, Thomas Bryant, Jarvis Walker, even a guy like a Ben Shepherd, right? Like a bunch of guys that just kind of come in and kind of know their role, right? And you have Halliburton kind of controlling all of it by and large, right? So, and the thing with them offensively is, unlike Boston, their offensive attack is a lot more balanced, I would probably say, right? Like they still will attempt threes, but not to the degree of Boston. But then they also will take shots from like the mid range. They'll take shots from, like from the at the rim. They have multiple guys who can kind of hit pull up shots off the dribble. They got guys who will post up. So they have a lot of different ways that they can score. And that's probably going to really test the Knicks defense. I think in some ways that even Boston may not necessarily have been able to. But like you said, you look at the Knicks defensive personnel, and they still have a bunch of guys that, like you said, you can put OG on Halliburton for stretches if you wanted to. You can put, if you wanted to, Bridges. Or, you can even put some of those guys on some of their other guys, right? Like a Nemhart or, I guess, Siakam. He's probably a key matchup in this series, right? Because he's got a little bit more length, right, than some of those guys. So can he kind of find ways to maybe kind of get around those guys? Can the Pacers get in transition? That's a big thing for them too, right? Because like the Knicks, they can get out and run, but we know for the Pacers, like that, they live and breathe that. That's a big way that they like to score. So it's probably going to come down to, like which team is actually going to be able to defend the other for just enough stretches. And then, like you said, in the fourth quarter, right? We know the Pacers in the postseason have been very good late in games, being able to kind of pull out wins regardless of the outcome, but so have the Knicks. So, like you said, this will probably be, I think, the Knicks' biggest test, even more so than Boston,
I
just
agree.
because it seemed like we just didn't get Boston's best. And some of that's the Knicks defense, and then some of that is the shortcomings of some of the guys for the Celtics and whatnot. But I think I'd still expect probably Brunson to be the best player in the series as he's been
Hmm.
so far through the postseason. But right, the thing is for the Pacers, right? Can they slow down some of these other guys? Right? Can they have like 5, 6 other guys, right, that can kind of show up, uh, at different spots to kind of help out their key guys. So there'll be a lot, I think, to kind of look for in this series. But it should be fun. And then the Knicks, can the two big lineups still be effective? It should be in theory against the Pacers, right? Like they, I guess, have some different looks in terms of bigs, right? But it's different than what the Knicks can put out there, right? Because like they start, I guess, with Siakam and Turner. Guess you could count that as two bigs. But then they can also roll with like Toppin and Thomas Bryant, right? And things like that. But, I would expect the Knicks, two big lineup to continue to be super impactful. And it needs to be, right? Because like you're gonna need to get extra chances to be, so that way you don't give the Pacers opportunity to get the board and get out and run. So, like I said, I would say Knicks in 7, but I do think it's a coin flip. I think the Pacers can win this series, and I think there's still going to be a lot of people that now will pick the Pacers to win. I'm curious to see, what the odds are in terms of how they feel about what this series is going to be because I haven't looked at it, and we don't do sports betting, but it always kind of gives some interesting insight into what people think, right? Because by and large, it looks like the Knicks are a slight favorite. So they look like a slight favorite.
I
So
mean, that
we'll
makes
see what
sense.
happens. But I think and again, will home court matter? If you're the Pacers, you got to steal one of the first two games. If you can steal one of the first two games, you got a decent shot at winning the series. But if the Knicks can if they can hold home court and win probably the first two games, I think they got a pretty good shot at being able to win out. Because then all you got to do is just win one in Indiana, and then you're okay. That's kind of the typical pathway. So, and this is the chance for the Knicks, right? Because again, you may not have to face any 60-win teams, right? But if you can get out of the Eastern Conference, you might have to, and we'll get into that soon. But this is a kind of the benefit of going all in the way they did in the summer, or going into the season, right? Because now you're seeing the benefits of that pay off in the playoffs, and they have a real shot to potentially win it all.
Yeah, that's gonna be wild.
Yeah. Are there any other key guys? I mean, I know you kind of mentioned Andrew
Yeah, no,
Nemhard, right?
that guy scares me, and I feel like he might
Yeah.
actually be
Hmm.
the Knicks' worst nightmare. Because I don't know if you've seen the clips, but I mean, you and I probably already both know what he does defensively is
Oh, yeah.
quite annoying.
Now he did get torched by Brunson last year,
Yes, he
and then
did.
I think they had to put Neesmith on him,
Yeah,
and then that kind of was able to slow him down. And also the Knicks had the injury, so that was another part of it as well. So that's going to be the benefit of having those other guys. Like, can Bridges give you some creation? Can OG give you some? Can Towns take some pressure off? It's going to be a team effort, right? It's not like if it's like Brunson has to score like 30 plus every game in order for them to win, they're probably going to lose,
yeah,
right? Just, but if it's like a balanced offensive attack, right, then that's their best shot to win. Kind of like the Pacers, right? Like they're not going to win the series because one guy pops off. And for the most part in the playoffs now, that's kind of how you have to win. But yeah, he's going to be a key factor in the series because you're thinking like you're probably putting your best defender on Halliburton, and then you're going to have to probably put at least one wing guy on Siakam. And then where does that leave, Nemhard, right? Who's
Ooh,
going to be guarding him? Probably the other wing, right? But but who knows, right? Because you may have to use both wings on Halliburton and Siakam, right? Because I don't think you could probably put like a small guy on Siakam, right? Because
well,
he's pretty good at being able to kind of score over smaller guys because he's got like a decent amount of length and savvy. Like like Josh Hart, could he guard him? Maybe, but I don't know. Like that seems like it may be a little bit of a tough matchup. So that's the part where like if they have to divert their defensive resources to the other guys, then Nemhard's probably going to be able to kind of go off and do his thing. And like you said, if he comes to the party and gives you anything close to what he's been doing in the playoffs, I mean, he's at what, like 50 from the field and 50 from three,
Yes, it's crazy,
15 a
bro.
game.
And he
Yeah, so like
shoots like 29% in the regular season from the 3-point line. It's crazy.
right.
But defensively is where he scares me. Because if he
Mhm.
does that pull the chair thing, yeah, it's over. I'm not gonna lie, because that's gonna just create massive havoc. It's gonna take Brunson, I feel like, off his game a little bit. Then you're gonna have to rely on Towns maybe a little bit more than you should, even though he is super dominant,
Yeah.
inside the arc this year. So props to him on that. But I feel like that's the cool thing about this matchup is there's a lot of counters,
Mhm.
for both of these teams for pretty much everything that they do, right? Because you would look at it
Yeah.
and you're like, oh yeah, we could take Halliburton out of the game. Well, now you have to worry about Siakam, right? And it's the
Mhm.
same thing with what New York does as well. So
Yeah.
I don't know. It's going to be a wild series.
And like, when you look at the Knicks center matchup, right? Like the thing is like say when the Pacers were playing the Cavs, right? Like Allen's not a stretch guy, right? Like he's
Mhm.
just strictly a guy that gets most of his offense inside. I mean, I know Mobley can hit the outside, right? But
Right.
he's usually playing the four. I know when Allen's off the floor, he'll play the five. But still, like now, like by and large, you're either having to guard Towns, who can, shoot from three and stretch the floor, although he didn't do that as much in the Celtics series, didn't really need to. Or, you'll still have Robinson, who can batter you around the inside. So that's kind of a big thing that you got to look for, right? Like I think, like I said, the boards is going to be a big factor. If the Knicks can continue to control the rebounding situation, then that's going to help them, because then we know they're going to be able to clear defensive possessions, and then they're going to be able to get extra possessions. But if the Pacers can limit that, right, then kind of limit the Knicks to one touch, then that'll help. But we know the Knicks offensively, again, we haven't seen them at their best, right? And, there could be a scenario where they finally kind of get, consistent start to finish offensive performances. Maybe not like the one we saw in game 6, but just better than what we saw, for most of the postseason so far. There's definitely potential for that. And if that happens, then there's potential for them to end the series quickly. But I do think that the Pacers, defensively can still kind of limit them in certain ways. But like you said, there's a lot of back and forth. There's a lot of ways to counter. It just, it's just going to come down to, like you said, like which team can kind of execute towards the end of the games better, which matchups pop off, right? Which kind of strategies, kind of end up working out. So, like I said, this should be a really fun series, I think.
I agree.
Because for most of the conference finals, we didn't get like a ton of great start to finish basketball, right? We got like a couple of short series. And then obviously this series, I think, wasn't the best version of it. But obviously, like through the first couple of games, that was pretty cool just, to see the Knicks be able to come back. But
Hmm.
I think this one should be, I don't know if I would say all timer, but I think it's going to be a great series.
I think it's going to be all time. So I agree with you.
Yeah. Yeah. So then now moving on, I guess we'll go into the other team that got eliminated, right? We'll move on to the Western Conference, right? The Wolves eliminating the Golden State Warriors, right? So the Wolves go to back-to-back conference finals, right? That's the other team, funny enough, right, that made a big trade in the summer, right? Or I guess the offseason to try to potentially improve their chances, right? Or at least change the team. And you look at it from, the Warriors' perspective. We'll start there, right? Obviously, no Steph other than 13 minutes of game 1, right? He strained his hamstring. A lot of talk about him potentially coming back for game 6, but if you're the Wolves, right? They were able to close it out to the point where he couldn't come back. And we talked about it the last time we recorded, because I think it was game 2, right? When the Wolves got their bounce back win. I think that was the last time we recorded. And we said, like, with Steph out, you should not lose another game if you're the Wolves, right? Because if you're Golden State without Steph, you just don't have a lot to turn to for consistent offense, right? Where, they had to kind of dust off Jonathan Kaminga, right, without Steph. And, to his credit, he actually gave them some pretty good offensive games, right? He gave them some really good production. But then you look at some of the other guys in the supporting cast, you didn't get much out of Pods until the last game. You got really nothing out of Moses Moody, right? Him kind of going from like starting to being just an unplayable guy was just kind of unexpected in some ways, right? I mean, I guess you didn't know what to expect post Jimmy Butler trade, but just as a whole, right? The shifting of a lot of these guys, and some of that's just like the tier that a lot of the role players are in, where like some of these guys kind of range from being okay to not great, but also like they're elevated a lot because of the Steph factor, right? And then you even look at a guy like a Draymond Green, right? Like this was not his best series, right? Is on either end of the floor, right? Because offensively, um, he was pretty absent, right? Other than like game one, right? His shot wasn't really there. A lot of turnovers, right? Just kind of a lot of rough possessions. And, defensively, we know he can defend, right? But he kind of met his match in this series, right? Where there was just a lot of size, right? Randall absolutely went off. And obviously, when we get to the Wolves part, we can talk about that. You look at Butler, right? Outside of game three, right? He really didn't give you a whole lot. I know he was hurt. And I think in one of those games, he'd had an illness, but he just didn't get enough from the non-Steph guys to be able to win you the series. And I think both you and I kind of lean towards Minnesota was probably going to win the series. Like once it became clear that Steph was going to miss most of the series, right at that point, right? I think you were more certain, right? But I think we both felt like the Wolves were going to win, just because it's pretty difficult. It's tough because you feel like you couldn't win a game. I mean, you won game one, but you knew that wasn't sustainable because it was just like the Warriors had a super hot night shooting from three, right? Even like Draymond and some of these other guys, right, who aren't consistent 3-point shooters went off. And then the Wolves went like, what, 0-4 in the first half from three, right? So, if you look at this Golden State team, again, I think you'd still probably consider it a successful year, just given the fact that, like, I know what you mean, but like, you go into the season, we had no expectations for this team, right? I don't think we even thought they'd make the playoffs, right? It's kind of like, say, a couple years ago when the Lakers went to the conference finals, right? We had no expectations for the team. They make a trade. They end up going further than expected. It still kind of stinks because it feels like if you're Golden State, like maybe if Steph was healthy, you could have gone further. Maybe you could have gone to the conference finals. Who knows? Maybe you could have gone to the NBA finals because this year was kind of, this year was kind of like topsy turvy. But I think the main question is what do you do in the summer, right? Because presumably you're going to have to do something about the Kuminga situation, right? It feels like a sign and trade, but you don't really know. And then even there, you're going to have to work around the margins because with the salaries they have, it's going to be another team that doesn't have a ton of flexibility to really bring in big pieces. But I think the hope is maybe you swap out Kuminga with something. Who knows? Maybe it's like a sign and trade where he goes to Brooklyn and you bring in Cam Johnson or something, right? Then what do you do with Payton and Looney? Because I believe they're going to be free agents. So do you bring them back? I'm assuming you do, but I don't know. I mean, like they might, they probably will, because they're not. I mean, like they're probably going to do that. And then continue to hope for improvements from some of the young guys, right? Pods continue to get better. Post, can he actually be playable? And then Moses Moody, can he not completely suck? Or you may have to move those guys. So like the Butler trade kind of put them in the spot where like they're probably going to have to find ways to maximize the roster. I don't know if the ownership is going to be willing to kind of completely move all the young guys just for a potential chance at a title. I still don't think the odds of them winning it is likely. Like I still think they'll be a good team. And you can still be happy about like getting to the playoffs and potentially going to the second round, and maybe if you're lucky, maybe you go a little bit further. But with the Western Conference continuing to improve, like this feels like this was kind of the year. Like if you had like a real shot, like get Butler, get hot in the playoffs, maybe take advantage of some teams, see what you can do. But I just feel like it's going to continue to be tough because now your three best guys are all 35 plus, right? Steph will be 38. Draymond and Jimmy will be 36. They'll still be making a lot of money. And you don't really have like a ton of ways to improve the team. And I just, like I said, I don't know if I buy that like the ownership is gonna, make a lot of significant changes to make the roster better, right? Like in 2K, you could turn this around, just like that. But I don't know. I don't know what's gonna happen with that. But I would at least bank on Kuminga probably not coming back unless it's like the qualifying offer. Because I mean, they really only played him because they had no choice, right? Like, because he was getting DNPs um, in the beginning of the playoffs, right? The only reason he was getting real minutes was because of the injuries, to some of these guys. So I don't know. I mean, the Butler trade, yeah, it worked out, but like as we kind of figured, there's still work that has to be done. I just don't know. Even if you do that work, I feel like a title still probably isn't really in the cards. But this is still probably like a better version of what you would like to see with Steph than if they didn't do anything. Because if they didn't do anything, it would probably just be they would just suck for the next several years, and then he retires, and then that's it. At least you can feel, if you're like a fan, at least you can feel like kind of all right about this team and have some level of belief, even if I don't think a title is likely.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not gonna lie. This is kind of how I think I felt like the series was gonna go. I kind of
Hmm.
said it coming off of the Houston one, where
Hmm.
I felt like they were gonna be out of gas.
Right.
Didn't necessarily predict an injury. Prayers on that.
Right.
But you just felt like they were going to be too hobbled, and I thought Minnesota was going to handle them pretty swiftly,
Hmm.
and that's kind of exactly what happened. And I there's not a whole lot of words that I feel like you can really say except for
Hmm.
the guys outside of Steph. I think this series kind of exposed. Number one, we already knew how valuable Steph is to that organization. Clearly, like
Yeah.
that's a known and a given, but it also shows you they need a lot, of improvements. I feel like if they want to legitimately have, a true chance at getting,
Give people that
Steph.
can shoot.
Exactly. Like, bro, like that roster is freaking hilarious, and I guess, Jimmy Butler's like that acquisition is cool and all, but I feel like you didn't necessarily reap the rewards. I feel like that a lot of people were expecting. Maybe that's kind of unrealistic expectations from Warriors fans that kind of seeped into, mainstream media. But I feel like that aspect was somewhat underwhelming, especially in this series, because I feel like you could have gotten a little bit more from him in terms of a backpack. I feel like he didn't play up to that level that I feel like we know him as in playoff Jimmy, but neither here nor
Mhm.
there because it's not really a solo effort. It's a team effort, collective effort,
Right.
and that team is just not it. Clearly, Pajemski, I mean, he had a solid game, I guess, to get eliminated in, but that doesn't
Yeah, like
really help you.
two players basketball.
Horrible
Yeah.
throughout the entire series. Buddy Hield, like you could really just go down
Game
the
7.
list. Like you could go down the list and it's like, eh. And I'm not talking about, the entire season on the whole. I'm talking really mainly about, the Minnesota series, but
Mhm.
my God, yeah. I can't believe a lot of people really got brainwashed into thinking that this team was gonna go, super duper far, right? But the Rocket series, I guess, did trick a lot of people. But I knew as soon as they were gonna go up against the Wolves, there's no way
Mhm.
that Edwards and Julius Randle were just gonna just roll over and let these guys walk, to the to the Western Conference Finals. That was
Except
not
for
gonna
game
happen.
1.
That was not gonna
Except
happen. And I mean that
Mhm.
happens though. Like sometimes that
Yeah, for
really
sure.
does happen, right? Like
Yeah.
that's why game one is somewhat important, but at the same time you can look at it from a complete opposite lens. Well, rest versus rust. Like that happens a lot.
Yeah.
Um
The rest versus rust argument really took a hit,
yeah,
uh,
it
this
did.
post.
Yeah. So, we'll see, what the Wolves can do, but for the Warriors, I think they do need to figure something out because can't run it back. That's clear and evident, and they won't.
Right.
Take care of the
Right.
Kuminga situation. You need to find a way to recoup some sort of asset that will actually be useful in play,
Mhm.
especially come postseason, because I think they do need to look at the postseason, or look at the offseason with the postseason lens in mind, right? You want to kind of be looking forward, but also keeping in mind, well, Steph probably doesn't have as many good years left in him.
Right. You still gotta get through the regular season because that's the issue is you're gonna have to balance getting guys that you know can help you in the playoffs, but also having guys that can get you through the regular season to kind of balance out, some of the because even like a Butler, right? He played pretty much every game as a Warrior once he got traded, I think except for like what one regular season game, and then obviously in the playoffs, got hurt in game 2, missed game 3. But next year, right, he's probably not playing like all 82 game. I mean, nobody really does at this point, but like you know what I mean, right? Like he's not a guy that usually plays like 65, 70 plus games, right? That's not really his thing. You're still probably also going to have to manage Steph. But I think, the most important things for them is like, can you get another big so that way it's not like Draymond almost always at the 5? Because like, can work for stretches and it can work against certain teams. But if that's your only real option, it kind of hurts because, you look at the other bigs, like Trace Jackson Davis, he started, but he played like 6 minutes because he didn't really do anything, right? And what a fall off for him, right? Because that was a guy that we liked in the draft for different reasons, even from what we saw as a Warrior, had a pretty good rookie year. And then this year took like a huge step back, right? Like, if it's not a dunk, it's not going in, which is wild, right? Because in college, he showed some touch, right? Like, because he was more like a post scorer, right? When we talked about him, in college, because I remember when we went through all those guys in the mock draft and things like that. So they need to find some type of playable big. Obviously, it doesn't have to be like a full-time center, just because like we know that they like Draymond at the 5. Get some real shooters, get a wing, but can you get all of that in one summer? I don't know. Like you're probably gonna have to sacrifice, and this was kind of the reason why like both you and I like we viewed him as a contender, but not likely to be able to get to the finals and win it all because so much has to go your way, especially if you're doing it from the play-in. It's very difficult, right, to do that. And even with like the Lakers, like we were probably just too optimistic on the likelihood of both of these teams being able to go as far. I mean, the Lakers one is more disappointing because they got smoked in the first round in 5.
Yeah.
But as a whole, like, it just felt like we were probably, and we didn't have either of them coming out of the West anyways, right? We both had Oklahoma City. And we'll see if that pick holds up. But just, as a whole, I just think with the way the Western Conference is looking, once we talk about that lottery stuff, right? Like, I just think it's going to be very difficult for those teams to realistically be able to make another championship run because they feel like they're just going to have to be in the tier where everything's going to have to go right. And there could be a year where everything goes right, but it's going to get tougher and tougher, especially out West. But I would still say like the Butler trade ended up working out because it was funny because I was listening to another podcast, right? It was the Zach Lowe podcast, and he had this guy Logan Murdoch, right, who's been who's covered the Warriors for a long time, and he was talking about like that, because we have kind of forgot about this, right? Like Butler was not initially the guy that they wanted to get, right? Like there were rumors about him, but like they kind of had, they wanted Durant, remember? Because at the deadline they were trying to get him, and then he didn't want to go there, and then they end up pivoting to Jimmy Butler, and they gave him the contract, right? So we'll see where that comes out. But it ended up working. Like it ended up being a really good fit for them. It's just like you said, they still have a lot of other work to do to get into like, oh, could they actually possibly get to like the finals mix? But like I said, even then, I just feel like it's pretty difficult. But the injury to Steph definitely is a bummer because like you just kind of wanted to see, maybe they still lose to Minnesota anyways, but it was like you definitely weren't winning this series without Steph. Like both you and I felt like that Minnesota was going to win once that happened because just you look at the other side and, from a Wolves perspective, right, you go there, right? What a turnaround it's been for Julius Randle, right? Like that's a guy where, we're not huge fans. We recognize his talent, right? But the concern was always like, what is this guy going to look like in the postseason? Because his track record was pretty spotty, even though it was a small sample size. But he's been like their most consistent player through this postseason, right? Because like even Ant, like you watch him in the second halves of these games, and he's he ends up being really good. But like in the first halves, like it's really Randall that's kind of getting them through a lot of that, right? And super impressive just from that perspective where he's kind of using like the best aspects of his game and kind of taking a lot of the bad stuff out. Like there's still rough parts here and there, maybe the turnovers, offensive fouls, things like that. But it's a lot more good. It's like the best version I think of him that you could probably see, where he's consistently playing downhill. He's taking advantage of these smaller matchups. He's able to kind of also do some point forward playmaking stuff, which we did talk about going into the season, that was something that Minnesota would get from Randall, is that like as a passer playmaker, he is better at that than Towns. Even though Towns can do it to an extent, he's not really bringing up the ball and like initiating offense, right?
Sure.
It's more so like he can catch the ball up at the top and find cutters.
He knows how to swing it.
Right, but Randall can actually initiate
Yeah.
your offense to another extent. And, even a guy like a Mike Conley, who we thought was kind of washed from what we saw earlier in the season, but, in this series, he actually ended up being pretty impactful on both ends of the floor because there were possessions where he was looking like would have been pretty outmatched defensively. But then you see, like, what was it, game 3? Like, there was a pivotal possession where Kuminga's got the ball. He's driving to the basket, and then he sets up the play where Ant ends up stripping him, and then Gobert runs down the floor and gets a dunk, right? And the supporting cast for Minnesota as well. Like, you got a couple of good DiVincenzo games by the end. Um, Jaden McDaniels, right now, his offense looks a lot more consistent than it did, at different points, right? Where now you're kind of consistently getting somewhere around 15 points or more from him, and that's what you want because you need another guy offensively who can kind of play off what Ant and Randall can do, and even Gobert, right? Like, this is back-to-back closeout games where he's a big factor. I mean, in this game, right, where there was nothing Golden State could really do, and like the fact that they were able to find minutes for him and get him to be more playable. Whereas, like in the early part of this series, it was pretty rough for him, mainly on the offensive end of the floor.
Mhm.
That's good to see, if you're Minnesota, right? Because that's always the concern about Gobert. It's not really the defensive end of the floor. It's really more so the offense because Golden State's still a small team, so he's got to be able to take advantage of, some of these matchups where, he's got a smaller guy on him and he's got to find ways to impact the game on that end of the floor. Because otherwise, then it's kind of like you have to put Reed out there, and his shot making is good, right? But defensively, it's just different, right? Like he's just not as good defensively as Gobert. But they've been able to find ways to make this work. Again, no Steph, but still impressive, right? And then you look at Ant, and you see some of his playmaking strides, right? Like in the elimination game, a lot of turnovers, right? Which was not really great. But you did get, also 12 assists, right? And him being able to kind of swing the guys and also kind of balancing out the attack. So I think there's still some good things. There's still some bad, some ugly that you see from Minnesota a lot. But either way, back-to-back conference finals with, a pretty significant change in the rotation. Like, this is a successful season so far. It's just a matter of, what is it going to look like once they, know their opponent in the conference finals. But what did you see from Minnesota that impressed you in the series, if anything?
Everything. How about that? I didn't expect them to even make it this far. This was not on my bingo card, right?
Mm-hmm.
I thought, you know, I liked the Towns trade for both of these squads, New York and Minnesota, but I think I liked it a lot more for New York. But now I'm looking at it, I'm like, wow, like it's he's been an amazing addition, for this team in
Yeah.
the postseason. He's opened up the playbook tremendously, and I feel like, we already knew that he's a walking mismatch, and he can do pretty much everything when he sets his mind to it. But holy cow, I didn't really expect him to be this efficient, this
Mm-hmm.
game changing for this team in the postseason. I thought it was going to be the complete opposite. I thought things were going to be too cluttered, things were going to get mucked up. I thought it was going to look like how they looked early in the regular season, where there was no chemistry. Because how like in theory on paper, how would you balance a guy like Anthony Edwards or Julius Randle and Gobert, all in the same
Right.
team, right? Because you would think, well, what does that look like 3-point shooting wise? Well, obviously Ant's leap on the 3-point line, and his shooting opens up a lot too. So I feel like the progression from a lot of these guys and what they're able to do together as a unit is pretty sweet. And then Jaden McDaniels, being that guy who can kind of come out of nowhere and be a third option some nights. I think that's pretty special as well. So, everything that they've done throughout the postseason has really impressed me. And throughout the series, it's the Warriors without Steph, so I kind of ignore that a little bit, but still
Right.
to kind of handle them in the way that I thought that they would is pretty cool. So I feel like they're living up to the expectations now that they've set coming off of the Lakers series and the Warriors series as well.
Yeah. Through 10 games in the postseason, Randall's averaging 24, 6, and 6, right? So
Dog.
by far the best postseason he's had, right?
Mm-hmm.
When you compare it to, and there was kind of an argument that some people made where it's like, hey, well, for the Wolves, he's no longer going to be like the number one guy, right? But like, but then it's like, how did that explain his last postseason in New York, right? Where he, it was where Brunson was there, and maybe there was some growing pains there, but just as a whole, it feels like he's definitely upped his game and, like I said, cut out a lot of the bad parts of his game, right? Like the shot selection's a lot better. The decision making is still really good, and again, he's helping to lead this team, right? Because that's the other thing, is that he's been a leader for this team, right? Which again is kind of still led by a really young guy in Ant, right? Whereas Randall's kind of a veteran at this point, and he's also in a contract year, and that's the great thing for him, because now, regardless of what happens, right? If he really wanted to, he could opt out and get a bigger long-term deal, right? Whether it's from the Wolves or some other team, probably Minnesota. I wouldn't think they would let him go after the way he's played for them. But just as a whole, yeah, super impressive from Minnesota. And again, like you said, it's without Steph. But again, that's kind of unfortunately been, this postseason and previous ones, that's been a big part of it. Is like there's been a lot of guys that unfortunately got hurt in the playoffs, and we didn't really get to see the best versions, but that's kind of how it goes, right? Even like a Draymond, right, at in his post, or I guess the elimination presser, right? He kind of mentioned like, yeah, you still have to give props to Minnesota, right? Because you still have to win the series, and they were like, we've even won series, right, where guys were in or out or whatever. So that's kind of how the playoffs goes, right? You need luck to go your way, and for Golden State, it was bad luck, right? A lot of great things during the regular season post Butler trade, but in the playoffs, right, Butler gets hurt first round, then Steph gets hurt in the second round and can't even play, and it's just a bummer for them, right? But for Minnesota, you're moving on, and you're in a decent spot now, right? Because regardless of who comes out, like they've played them well in the regular season, but feel like there is one team that I think they would probably prefer to see over the other, and I guess we'll get into that series because we have a game 7. We're gonna have just one game 7 match up in the second round, and that's gonna be the Denver Nuggets and the Oklahoma City Thunder, right? And it's funny because we picked the Thunder to win in 5. Literally did not happen whatsoever, right? A lot of bungled games from Oklahoma City. You do give credit to the Denver Nuggets for, doing what they're kind of supposed to do in some of these close games, because we know they have, the championship DNA. They're a team that's been in a lot of game 7s, a lot of close games, competitive games, on their way towards a title. But just as a whole, right? Some of the concerns about Oklahoma City you're kind of seeing in this series, right? The offense, the lack of creation outside of SGA, right? Just, in that game 6, pretty brutal. I think the last time we recorded, right, I think it was before, no, it was, I want to say it was after game 4, right? Because I'm pretty sure we talked about that because of how ugly it was. But then game 5, right, that was a big game where that was an all-timer game, right? Where Denver gets punched first, then responds and bounces back, and has the lead for most of the game. And then Oklahoma City was able to, for back-to-back games in games 4 and 5, control the fourth quarter, right, to go up 3-2. And then you have game 6, right, where Denver has an early lead, right? Jamal Murray has, I guess, a flu game, right? And it's funny because of the fact that Oklahoma City bounces back and goes up by double digits. But then SGA gets into foul trouble and picks up 4 fouls, including a couple of just dumb fouls, right? And because he picks up his 4th foul, he has to come out and sit at the end of the first half for the last couple of minutes. Denver immediately rattles off a run to get the game basically back within, striking distance. I think they tied it. Then Lou Dort hit a 3 at the buzzer. Then in the third quarter, at one point, Dagnall gambled and kind of took SGA out, I think, to protect him from getting a 5th foul. And they scored the first few possessions, right? But then they just fell apart offensively. And by the time they got him back in, it felt like it was kind of too late. All of a sudden, Julian Strother, right, who's been pretty much a 0 for them in the postseason, comes out, and he has a big game, big second half for them. And it's definitely rough. The reporting was, interestingly enough, was before the Knicks game, there was reporting about Aaron Gordon, because if you didn't know, or if you hadn't seen it, he got hurt kind of right at the end of game 6. And now he's got supposedly a strained hamstring, right? Well, I don't mean supposedly like he doesn't have it, but he's got a strained hamstring. The reporting from Shams was that his status was in doubt. Now he's listed as questionable, and I believe we got reports right before we got on from David Adelman, right, that he's a game time decision and that he did go through a walkthrough. We're recording this on Saturday, so I don't know if he plays. If he doesn't play, I think you have to kind of tip the game towards Oklahoma City. But even if he does play, how much can he realistically give them? That's a really tough spot for Denver to be in because he's been so good for them in the postseason on both ends of the floor. But it is one game. So, like, you could, in theory, pull this out if you're Denver, if Aaron Gordon either can't give it a go or is just kind of hobbled or limited. But if you're Oklahoma City, this is the biggest game essentially of all of these guys' careers, right? Because of the fact that none of these guys outside of, I guess, Caruso have essentially been in a game seven, or he wasn't even in a game seven, right? I mean, but he was on the title team for the Lakers, but like none of these guys have been in a game of this magnitude, right? Where there's a lot on the line, there's huge stakes involved. Obviously, this is the youngest team in the league, and this is kind of a not great spot for them to be in. But this is a chance for these guys to be able to kind of, showcase that no, we can win competitive game sevens. We can win these type of matchups. Because we saw it in games 4 and 5, but we're gonna need one more if we want our pick to be right and for them to advance to the conference finals. But I don't know. I feel like you need to win it running away. I don't like the idea of being in a close game against the Nuggets in a game seven if I'm the Thunder, just because at that point, then you're kind of like trying to match Denver offensively. Jokic, even with or without Gordon, he can still be dominant. Jamal Murray could have a huge game. Somebody off the bench, who knows? Russ, I don't know. Maybe he's been kind of wild and chaotic in a bad way for the most part the last couple of games, but just as a whole, like to me, if you're Oklahoma City, like I think you kind of have to set the tone from the start and run away with it. I just do not think you want to be in a 2 possession game against Denver with, less than 5 minutes to go in a game seven. I don't think you want to be in that spot. Obviously, we picked them to win this series, so I'm going to continue to go down with the ship. I think the Gordon injury potentially, right, is kind of a life's raft. I mean, that doesn't sound good, but you know what I mean? Like, if Gordon is not close to 100%, you should win this game, I think, if you're Oklahoma City, right? Because at that point, who on earth is Denver going to be able to bank on and count on if Gordon either, like I said, can't give it a go or is super hobbled? Like OG Anunoby last year, right? He tried to play in Game 7 against the Pacers, and he played like 2 minutes or something like that. He just had nothing left. And, just I don't know what we're going to see from Aaron Gordon, but just to me, I don't know. It's because without him, like I said, Denver's basically down to 5 guys, and I don't know who you're gonna expect anything out of from outside of Jokic and Murray if you can't get a good Gordon game. But again, OKC they could easily blow this as well. But I'm gonna pick them to win the game seven. And I hope it's a fun game. But I just think for OKC's sake, gotta win it decisively. And I think if you can get out of this series, I think you'll be in a great spot the rest of the way. But man, this is not the ideal situation to be in, I think, if you're Oklahoma City.
Um, I'm kind of on the inverse, I guess.
Okay.
I feel like this is probably the best test for them.
Okay.
Just because I feel like, you have the talent, right? That's never been an
Hmm.
issue. I think it's
Right.
always been the experience, right? If they come out of this, series
Yeah.
alive,
Right.
healthy,
Yes.
um, I think that's a huge confidence boost, not just
And
for
that is
this year.
powerful at the end of it.
You know what I'm saying? Like, not just for this year. I think long term, they can set themselves up to be, one of the
Right.
more dominant forces for a long time in the league. I feel
Yeah, they
like,
can go get Giannis if they lose.
yeah, that too. You have a bunch of assets. You have a safety net. If everything
Right.
hits the fan. But I feel like this is best case scenario for them because there is a little bit of, I guess, a back and forth right now. Right? You're gonna have home court. It's gonna be in your arena. We already know that environment is wild. Granted, they've dropped some games in that arena.
Hmm.
But it's time to show people, number one, who the MVP is. I know that's a regular season award, but
No, we
Also,
still
number
don't
two,
have that award
exactly.
yet.
We still don't have it yet. And it's kind of wild that this series has, two MVP candidates. So we're blessed in that regard. But it's time for J-Dub to show up. I'm gonna be honest
Yep.
with everybody. I didn't watch the last game. A lot of stuff going on with, outside of the podcast, but the box score did not tell me a good story, right?
He wasn't good.
Um
I watched it. He was
yeah.
not good.
Yeah.
Defensively, he was really good, but offensively,
And
disaster.
that's the thing. Defensively, he's amazing. Night in, night out, I feel like throughout the regular season and the postseason, he's generally been, one of those, top dogs defensively, right? But offensively, I feel like he's got to be in his own head or something, because there's some things that I think he does on the offensive end of the floor that you really can't teach. Like there's things that only that guy can do. But then when it doesn't go well, he doesn't even look like he should be the second option on this team, and that's really concerning, right? Because I feel like I said, I'm going based off the box score, right? If he showed up in that game, then we'd be talking about the Oklahoma City, versus Timberwolves conference finals, but instead we're talking about a game 7, right? So he needs to show up. He needs to be on his A game. We've seen, I think, Shea in a game 7, I believe, when he was in the
Yeah,
bubble,
that was
correct?
back in the bubble.
Exactly. So that's the last time that he's been here, right? So this is kind of big for his career as well. So like you said, it's big stakes, but I think that's the best case scenario for them, because they need to show and prove that they can really close out games and stuff like that. So there's some things going in their favor, like you talked about with the Aaron Gordon injury, and I think they have some advantages here that they need to take care of. If they squander the opportunity, then I'll probably never really recover from that, in terms of picking them. And I know that sounds kind of selfish, but I'm just being real. Like I'm not going to trust that team going forward. It's going to be very similar to yeah, exactly. It's going to be very similar to Cleveland. Like, I'm gonna keep it a buck. I'm probably I'm never picking Cleveland again down the line until they shake something up or something gives.
The good news is we didn't. I mean, we
Exactly.
picked them to win the series, but neither of us picked them to win the title.
Right. So, they got to get it done. That's what I'm going to leave it at. But I don't think it's like, worst case scenario, right? I feel like it was. I know, but I'm saying, like, I feel like worst case scenario would have been like you were down super early in the series, right? And you couldn't even get it to 5 or 6, right? That's what I feel like worst case scenario would have been.
Well, that's fair. Right. That's fair. Yeah, I do think I agree with you. Like I said, at the end of my first statement, I do think if they can get out of this, then I think they have a good shot at still being able to win it all. And it's funny because our picks didn't really suggest it, but I remember before we picked OKC in 5, we thought this could possibly be their toughest series. And now, when you say it's in 5, that suggests it's not going to be a tough series, even if you think the games are competitive. But, I think a big part of it is shortchanging Denver, right? And just how impressive they've been in terms of being able to win this game and do things that I don't think we really expected, right? Like defensively, like they were horrible in the regular season, right? They were one of the 10 worst teams defensively in the league, I think, if I'm not mistaken, right? I think they went into the playoffs as the worst defensive team in the playoffs. That means that they were worse defensively than teams that were like, 7 or 8 seeding wise, right? Like that means like Miami was a better defensive team and they were a 10 seed. So that's some, and again, some of it's like the amount of zone defense that we've seen in the postseason, especially from also like Denver, and OKC plays zone as well. And both teams are also partly doing it because it's like, yeah, we don't care about some of these guys as 3-point shooters. Like if you're Denver, it's like some of these guys are going to have to prove that they can make threes in the postseason. Like even a guy like a Lou Dort, what was he like? Almost 40% as a 3-point shooter in the regular season. How has that looked in the playoffs? It's not necessarily, it's not or even a guy like a Chet Holmgren, right? Kind of a similar thing, right? Like all these guys, like I'm looking at Lou Dort in the playoffs, he's shooting 29% from 3 on 7 attempts a game, right? Whereas in the regular season, it was not 29%, right? It was a lot better. So that's, I think, it was 41%. So even better than I thought. So, less attempts, but still. And that's also kind of like the difference between regular season and postseason basketball. And like the closeouts are different, right? I guess the pressure is also different as well, if you want to mention that. But to me, I think it's going to come down to the bench for Oklahoma City because they are the deeper team, and that's the benefit that they do have over Denver. Is like they have a couple of guys where it's like, okay, if you don't play as well, we could put another guy out there and kind of replace your production in some way, shape, or form, right? Like they're like, I don't know, if like a Lou Dort has kind of a rough game, maybe you could put Case and Wallace in there. Different look, right? But like you could put him in there. Aaron Wiggins, the other Jalen Williams, right? He's been actually pretty good as a big, right? Especially defensively. He's not as tall as Jokic, but he's done a good job physically, right? Because they've tried to have a second big out there next to Chet because they don't really want him on Jokic, for understandable reasons, right? They want him roaming around, being able to play help defense as opposed to being the main guy. Now Denver's trying to get Chet switched on to him, and that's why Jokic is doing those inverted pick and rolls and whatnot. So, yeah. But I think the main thing is to me the bench and Jalen Williams. If you can get, at least a couple guys off the bench, or if you can get a huge Jalen Williams game, preferably both, right? Then they should win. Then that's how they're going to win this game. I don't think you're going to have a game where it's like an SGA backpack where he has like 40 in a game 7 or something like that. I think it's going to have to be a collective team effort.
Yeah.
And now the thing is, unfortunately, aside from the Nuggets winning game 7 last year, or this year, my bad. We've had like a streak of the home team losing game 7s. So, the history is not great. It's not on Oklahoma City's side this time around. But, I think they will win game 7. I don't feel great about it, but, we'll see. But like I said, I think they have to run it. I think they have to run it up. I do, like, you cannot get into a close game, I think, ideally with this team because then you're banking on Jalen Williams. Please save us. It's a 2-point game. We need some baskets down the stretch. Maybe he does it,
That's
but
what I'm hoping for. That's what I'm banking on.
maybe he does it. Maybe he rises to the occasion. But it's been rough. It's been a really rough series for him on the offensive end of the floor. And it's tough because that game 3, he was awesome. And they could have won that game, right? Because then you could have said, all right, we got the Jalen Williams game that we needed. Then the rest of the way, he could have a mediocre, stretch, and all you just need is like one more decent game from your team, and then you could pull it out. But it feels like, you got to do that. And there's a lot of pressure, I think, because, again, I'm not saying that they're going to blow it up and trade for Giannis or some other superstar. Maybe they don't. It's just, again, considering how dominant of a team they were in the regular season, right? There's no more second chances, right? If you throw away another game, your season is over. But, I still have faith that they're going to be able to win it. Maybe it's just blind faith because, it hasn't, the series has not gone, I think, quite the way that we thought it might. But again, I'm just looking over at Denver and it's like, who would you expect to pop out, outside of the main guys in a game 7?
For Denver or Oklahoma City?
Yeah, for Denver.
That's the thing. I don't know.
Right, like they're basically down to like 6 guys, if
That's
that.
what I'm saying. So that's where I'm like, there's really no excuse for Oklahoma City to lose this, right? And that's why I'm like,
Right.
show the world why you're better, why you're the favorite. Simple as that, bro. Like, you're better. You're better than them. But they haven't played like it this entire series, which is the frustrating thing.
Yeah, so like I said, but then it's like in game 6 you got Julian Strother for Denver, right? And that kind of
Crazy.
and like you could say you could get if you're Denver and you get one more random guy off the bench because they've been right there with OKC in the series even without having the same level of depth. So then you're like, if we get a good Julian Strother game or like a good Peyton Watson or Russ game, we might be able to win. It's just like I don't know. I personally think I need to see Aaron Gordon play and be impactful for me to feel good about Denver's chances of winning.
I agree.
And I don't know how fair is it to expect. I mean, again, he went through, I guess, what did they say? Walk through. So I guess he went through whatever drills or other stuff that he needs to do. But I just don't. I don't know. I have no clue. Do you think he plays?
Yeah, I think he plays.
Okay.
I think they're
You think he
gonna
plays?
risk. Yeah, they're gonna risk everything to, potentially get back to,
Okay.
the Western Conference Finals.
Yeah. Yeah, if he's a game time decision, he probably at least tries to give it a go. I
Mhm.
just don't know how much he can give them.
Right, right, that's the question.
Yeah. And obviously the winner of this series will play the Minnesota Timberwolves regardless of who wins, the winner will have home court. So if Denver wins, they have home court. If you're Minnesota, I guess, who would you rather play?
Probably Denver.
Yeah, because there's a much bigger proof of concept over time of them being it. Now it is the playoffs, so it may look different, but we know that by and large Minnesota has had Denver's number dating back to last season, right? They've beaten them, I think, 10 out of the last 15 times they've played, if you count regular season this year and then like playoffs and regular season last year, something like that. So they've done a really good job against that team, swept them in the regular season series. Not that that even really means anything anymore, but
Yeah, I don't even take that
regardless.
into account.
Right, exactly. But it feels like they had their number. Do you think that there's a chance that Minnesota could beat OKC, or would you just probably just, pick Oklahoma City to win and kind of not even think about it?
There'd be a chance if it was Oklahoma City versus Wolves, I'd probably pick OKC in 7,
Hmm.
6 or 7. Like that's how competitive I feel like the series would be. But I don't think the Wolves would win it necessarily. Like they
Okay.
wouldn't be the favorite in that series for me
Right. But they
personally.
probably, yeah, but they might be favored over Denver. I
Yeah,
don't know. I don't know what Vegas.
I would favor them over
I
Denver in
yeah.
a heartbeat.
I think we said that like when we talked about Minnesota towards the end of the regular season when they were playing really well and I think it was after a game where they clocked it. It wasn't the double overtime win. It was a different game I think where they blew them out and it was like, yeah, if you're Denver, you don't want to play Minnesota in the first round because it looked like it was possible,
Yeah,
right? It
yeah.
could have happened if Minnesota had closed out the regular season a little bit better because they gave away a couple of games. But
Mhm.
I think we're set up for a really good conference finals regardless of what happens. Because we already know I think the East matchup would be good. And I think regardless of who wins, I think the West one will be really good as well. And then, obviously we'll go from there and see what happens.
Yeah.
Then moving on, the NBA draft lottery. I know it's been a minute. Obviously, we're doing this pretty late. It's been like what, almost a week since the draft lottery, but still can't really believe it happened. Like on our last episode, I know we kind of talked about like it's kind of silly to do it, but we kind of talked about like potential predictions, potential what we thought could happen for the lottery. None of that panned out. I believe we thought that the Spurs may get the number one pick and that Philly might lose their pick. Neither of those things happened, but we did have some early winners and losers from the draft lottery. One of the biggest winners, the Dallas Mavericks. 1% chance essentially of getting the number one pick. They got it. And it's funny because we talked about this not too long ago where I think we had a comment on a video a while back and it was about the Mavs, right? And like how they were struggling. I think it was after Kyrie got hurt, right? And like and we were kind of and you were kind of joking about like, yeah, tanking for Cooper Flagg. Then somebody in the comments was like, yeah, they have like a 1% chance or something like that. And they actually got it.
Uh,
I don't think they trade the pick. Spoiler alert. I think they will take him.
they're taking
And
him.
it'll be interesting to see how that looks, right? Because, now I guess in theory you don't feel as bad if you're Dallas in terms of trading Luka away because you got back AD. You got the number one pick in Cooper Flagg. I guess you got Max Christie and then a potential, future first from the Lakers. So I guess that's a decent return for Luka, right? But obviously, I'm very curious to see how that works because assuming you take Flagg, probably re-sign Kyrie and bring him back. But then you have a ton of front court guys where it feels like you don't really need all of them because then you're going to have Flagg, you're going to have AD, you're going to have Lively, Gafford, Washington, Najee Marshall. Like that's a lot of wings and bigs. And I just don't really know if you're going to really probably be able to keep all of them. So I'm curious to see how they balance all that out. But obviously, what a ridiculous win, for the Mavs, right? In terms of like, having the worst odds of getting the number one pick essentially. And you got it. I mean, that's crazy. But and then it kind of but then, to top it off, right? The Spurs, right? Kind of guess a little under the radar, they got the number two pick, right? So that's
Mm.
another draft where they kind of ended up bouncing up right in a spot because I think they had what the sixth or seventh best odds or something like. I think they moved up at least 4 or 5 spots, and they ended up getting the number 2 pick of the draft, which they could use to take either presumably Dylan Harper, or they could potentially use it in a trade and bring in somebody like a Giannis or someone else, right? Some other star. So they have a ton of flexibility, and then Philly kind of gets bailed out, right? Where a lot of people kind of thought that they might lose that pick, but they ended up not only keeping it, but it moved up to 3. So now they can take, a guy like a VJ Edgecombe or a Trey Johnson or Ace Bailey or whomever, or there's rumors that they may potentially trade the pick and kind of use it to get some immediate win now help, to kind of balance out their roster because their roster is different from say like the Spurs where like the Sixers put this team together in the last summer to try to win a title and that didn't work out. And at least even if Embiid just kind of can't really give it a go too much longer because of injuries, at least you do kind of get bailed out with the number 3 pick. So those are your obvious big winners, right? And then losers, pretty much everyone else, right? Because I mean you had multiple teams that had a chance to get 1, 2, and 3. They dropped, right? I believe the Jazz and the Wizards, right? They dropped from potentially 1 and 2 to 5 and 6, right? And then I think a couple other teams dropped a little bit. Like I think Brooklyn dropped by a little bit. I think the Raptors dropped by a couple of spots, but pretty tough, for them, right? Where it's like you have a chance to possibly get a franchise guy, you didn't get it, but this is kind of what the owners voted for, right, in a way, right? Because they all voted to overturn the former lottery odds in favor of flattened lottery odds to kind of reduce the tanking. And now, right, you're in a spot where those teams have still ended up not getting a top pick. So they're going to have a lot more work to do to be able to kind of get themselves out of the spot, that they're in. And we have seen some teams be able to do it. We saw the Pistons do it. We saw the Pacers do it. But
Well, they have
tough
franchise
break for those.
guys. Like, come
Yeah,
on, man.
tough break. Yeah, tough break for those teams, right? Because you had a real chance. Like if you're the Wizards or the Jazz, you had a real chance. Not that you would make the playoffs next year, but at least you had a real chance to potentially get a franchise guy. But now you're gonna have to wait longer, And I don't know a whole lot about the upcoming drafts from here on out. I know some of the names, but you don't even know what those guys are gonna look like, right? But what a huge day for those teams.
Yeah, as a Wizards fan, I couldn't be more depressed. I'm not gonna lie. Like, and it's actually pretty freaking angering if I'm gonna be honest, right? Because when was the last time they had a franchise guy? And even like Utah, like they squandered the opportunity with friggin' Donovan Mitchell. They sold that away completely, right? Like the last time the Wizards had a franchise guy, a legit one, not a fraudulent one. So I'm not talking about
Right,
Beal. I'm talking like John Wall for real. And what happened with
right.
him? He got hurt. So it's like, years and years of purgatory. And I don't understand the logic of the owners where it's like, yeah, we want to eliminate tanking. Well, how on earth are bad teams supposed to be able to build? That's what I don't understand, right? Because the Wizards last year, they got the number 2 pick. Is Alex Sarr going to be a franchise, game-changing guy? I don't think he's ever going to be an all-NBA player. Like that, I'm keeping it real. Like, you need an all-NBA player, at least one, to be on your team to even make the playoffs, realistically, right? And I don't know. It's just it's sad, it's disheartening, it's annoying as well, considering the fact that it was a 1%, 1.8% chance to be on the
Yeah,
dot in terms of getting
back-to-back
the number
drafts.
1 pick. Yeah, like come on, bro.
Because
1 point
I think the Hawks had a pretty low percent chance. I don't know. It may not have been 1%, but it was pretty close because they were in the play-in just like Dallas last year, right? So back-to-back drafts, I think,
but
where that happened.
but it's funny cuz there's a huge rift amongst like all the like parties of the NBA, right? And I consider the fans a big party because they're the ones who freaking put out their money to go see these games, right? So the fans are
Sure.
like, yeah, this thing is completely rigged, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I heard
Right.
like I did the research on like looking up like what the reaction was to like from the reporters when the number 1,
Yeah.
pick was
They're
went to
like
Dallas.
they were laughing.
Yeah, they were laughing. So
Yeah, they were laughing.
you have that on that end, and I believe going back to last year, they also said that multiple executives went up to the Hawks, representatives and executives or whatever, and were like, "We're glad you got the number 1 pick. Like, we want to see teams that are trying, get rewarded for
Right.
trying. And then I'm like, well, what the heck? Like, that's where I don't understand. Maybe I have a skewed perspective being a Wizards fan. How on earth is a
Mhm.
team like Washington supposed to get out of purgatory if they're never going to really be allowed a fair shake at getting the number one pick or a franchise changing guy, right? You see what I'm saying? So that's where I'm super confused. Um,
Mhm.
and I just don't think future wise I'm very hype on draft
Mhm.
stuff anymore like how I used to be a few years back where a lot of the top players would go to the worst record or the worst teams with the worst records, and I feel like that makes sense, right? You look at the NFL and what they do. There's a reason why a lot of the franchise quarterbacks and franchise cornerstones of those teams go to bad teams is because it's if you have the worst record, you get the number one pick. The only way you could squander that is if you trade that first round pick the year prior, right? So
Mhm.
that's where I don't understand where this whole logic came from because I don't know. I feel like it just screws over the little guy and the teams that can't really do anything because even like not even just from a Wizards perspective, but look at Utah. Like they're going to
Mhm.
suck again as well. But what do you want these teams to do? Their hands are tied. Their markets aren't appealing. They're not New York. They're not LA. They're not even Dallas. Right? They're not even San Antonio. They don't have a market that attracts free agents at all. So you can throw that free agency thing out the window. Like they're never going to get their franchise guy through a free agency or anything like that. Teams would never be willing to trade for a franchise guy or trade a franchise guy away to a team like Washington or Utah because they don't have assets that would be, even comparable to that. So that's where I'm like, I don't understand that at all. That system needs to go. It's the dumbest freaking thing I've ever seen in my life. It makes no sense from a Wizards fan perspective. It's annoying dropping from potentially 1 or 2 to dropping to 6. And I believe last year could have had Wemby. I don't
I
know.
guess 2 years ago. Yeah, because I think it was Detroit that had the worst record, and they dropped.
But we were one
To,
ping pong ball away from having the winning thing. So that's why I'm like, and another time, this one I think we were one ping pong ball away from having the
yeah.
the the combination that would have won. So it's like, what the heck are we doing, bro? It's just
And I
dumb. I
think
don't understand how the Mavericks are awarded a guy like Cooper Flag. And I'm not even pissed off about not getting number one. I'm pissed off about dropping to 6. That's the thing that freaking is frying my brain completely and makes me not even want to watch next year. It's
Yeah, that
stupid.
part I actually didn't know that you could drop to 6.
It's
I think
insane.
the Wemby draft, if I'm not mistaken, I think it was like Detroit had the worst record, and then they dropped from 1 to 5, and then they had to take what was it, a Sore Thompson, right? I
Yeah.
think that was that. Yeah, so like, yeah, I mean, it's tough because that means that that you're gonna have to find, like you said, other avenues, to be able to kind of get that guy, right? Like you said, like say with the Pacers, they got Halliburton, but they were able to get him by, I guess, moving Sabonis, right? And the Kings were like, yeah, we view Sabonis as a potential franchise guy, so we'll give you Tyrese Halliburton, and also we have Fox. So you kind of have to get lucky, right? And that's kind of like where a lot of that ends up having to come
Stupid.
from, but it's just not
Stupid.
everybody can get that luck,
That's stupid.
from year to year. So, for some of those like Utah, I'm gonna be honest, probably gonna be bad for at least a while now. I
I
mean,
mean, they're gonna get AJ
unless
DeBonsa next year. It's pretty much all but confirmed.
yeah,
AJ
maybe
even
yeah, maybe
said if they don't have the number one pick, he's going back to college. So
that's funny. Um, but yeah, so we'll see going forward. I mean, for me, I guess like in terms of lottery odds, the only thing that maybe I might consider changing is like maybe just having it be like the top 10 as opposed to like 14, because I just feel like you don't really need a play-in team
that's what
in
I'm
the lottery mix.
saying, bro. I don't understand that.
Yeah, that's probably like the only thing I would change, but it's also like that's what those guys voted for. So it's like, that's what they wanted. So they're probably not gonna, do that, vote to change it and then change it again. That's probably what it's gonna be, from here on out. And that's probably gonna be what the setup is like. But you never know. And like that's the tough part about this, and like for some of these teams, even a team like a Charlotte, right? They had some high draft picks, but like half of them stunk, or like just couldn't stay healthy. So, there's never a guarantee that just because you get high draft picks, because even Philly, right? They had years and years of high draft picks, and almost none of them ended up panning out. But just that all you need is one. So if you can get one, and you can get somebody in the draft, that could be really good. Who knows? Maybe there might be a guy at 6, or 5 that the Jazz or the Wizards take that ends up being way better than everybody expects. Who knows? Maybe a guy like, I don't know, a Jeremiah Fears ends up
Not
being
gonna
like a
happen.
real franchise point
Not gonna
guard, or
happen.
maybe Derek Queen ends up being like a big time, all-star caliber center. You never know, right? Because even in the draft, like a guy like a Halliburton, like people did not expect him to be, as good. But it's a tough situation for some of those teams. But yeah, like honestly, when the Mavs got the number 1 pick, I was definitely laughing. Well, I
Yeah, I
first
wasn't.
laughed. I first laughed when they got to the top 5 or whatever, and their name hadn't been called yet. Because because as they talked about, and as you know, right, like the teams already know like what picks they got. Like that's just kind of for us and I guess the representatives, but like the teams themselves, the front offices already know because they do, like you said, the ping pong ball stuff beforehand. But it was just funny because like the TV broadcast, they messed up and they were like, "Yeah, Philly lost their first round pick," and I'm like, "What the?" And I didn't see their picture. And then it was just like you were waiting to see what the Mavs were gonna get because they hadn't been called, and it was like, "Oh wow, that's yeah." It was kind of. I'm not gonna lie, I did laugh for a good 20 minutes or so afterwards because it was just so like just comedic in terms of, like the funniest outcome. Like I said, if I don't know if you're like an NBA fan, is it like the best outcome?
Worst possible.
No. Yeah, like probably like no, probably not. And it makes again what already is a ridiculous Western Conference even more ridiculous. Because I think at the very least, what you would like is maybe like how about some Eastern Conference teams get some? And I know like yeah, Philly and Charlotte got the 3 and the 4 pick, like, and that's cool. But just what the Spurs could do. I mean, they could turn that into Giannis, right? And the Mavs already have some veteran star guys on their roster, so like presumably Flagg could be ready right away, and like they could still be a good team.
You're a
But
joke, man.
and then obviously with Boston, they're gonna be kind of out of commission next year. Like I mean, they're not gonna be like a lottery team, I don't think, but like because they're in the East, but they're not gonna be a championship team, right? So that's another team that you have to cross off the list, in the Eastern Conference, and kind of just, you know, I don't know. It's a rough position to be in for those teams. So we'll see if they can bounce back. Because like you said, if you're a Wizards fan, you almost kind of wish you had gotten like the 6th pick last year,
That's what I'm
and then
saying.
hope that and then hope that like you get the 2 pick this. And like you said, Alex Sarr could be good, but probably doesn't have like a
Not at all
All
NBA
NBA,
caliber.
like one of the best players in the
No,
league ceiling.
no,
Probably
no.
doesn't have that in the cards, right? Um, but just as a whole, I mean, that's just it's rough. Like think about it if you're Atlanta, right? Like you got the number 1 pick, you got Reese Shea, and he looks like he'll be pretty good. But they're in a different spot because they already have Trey Young, so they already kind of have some, pieces
Like,
to kind of build around.
what is a
So
team without a franchise player supposed to do? That's what I don't understand. How are they supposed to get out of purgatory? They don't have any assets. They don't have any semblance of being good. Like, what is the point of this? That's what I don't understand. And it's freaking.
yeah, so
And I don't believe in coincidences. Like, what you expect me to believe that they traded away Luka Doncic and get Cooper Flagg in return in the draft? I don't think so. That's freaking stupid.
that bad.
I don't believe in coincidences when it comes to that. Like, I'm sorry, that makes me question a lot.
So now Cooper Flagg, I guess, presumably headed to Dallas. I'm curious to see what that looks like. I already talked about the front court stuff, but again, he should be good to go. If you're a Mavs fan, do you feel like that now you should be doing pretty good?
Yeah,
No hard feelings.
you got the number one pick.
Yeah,
What if you're a Mavs fan and you're not happy? I don't. There's something wrong with you.
yeah. Like, would you say that? Like, I guess now Nico Harrison, like his job, he's good now. He's set.
Yeah, I guess.
Like I,
And what
yeah.
was the other
I mean,
thing? What was the other thing that came out too? They said when they raised the ticket prices after they traded Luca, right?
yeah. Yeah, they
Yes, they
were gonna
did.
do that.
They did.
I think, yeah, I think they did that.
Yeah. So I guess the
And
ticket
now they
prices rise out of nowhere and you get the number one pick. Right.
And
Yeah.
for them also, like, I guess the valuation of the team now is gonna go up big time because now you have the return of a potential franchise. Just Dallas hoops, Texas hoops in general, right? Kind of cashed out in the last few weeks, right? Because you got the number one pick in both the NBA and the WNBA. Then you factor in the Spurs getting the number two pick, right, to continue to build what they have going on over there. And then, like Houston, I mean, has got something going. They got they didn't get a high, they got the 10th pick, so whoever they draft may not be that amazing, but they could use that in a trade to get somebody. Who knows? Maybe they go out and get Kevin Durant. Maybe they go get Giannis or, some other guy, or they just continue to build what they have. So, Texas hoops is looking up. It's not looking as good for the DMV.
Yeah, who you telling? I think we're all crying, bro. And the Capitals just got eliminated on the same day. So FYI,
Really?
yeah. So the same day
Yeah, the
that the
hockey team?
yeah, so the same day that the Wizards got the sixth pick, the Nationals lost, I believe, and the
Mhm.
Capitals got eliminated in the playoffs. So that was supposed to be
Yeah.
Ovechkin's you know, like LeBron kind of tour with like final ring or something like that. But
Yeah.
yeah, freaking, I don't know. I'm at a loss for words if I'm gonna be real. Like I said, it makes me question a whole lot, considering all that transpired leading up to this thing. But wow,
I think the
dude.
Mystics got their first regular season win, so you got that going for you.
Yeah, I don't even really watch them anymore. Oh.
Yeah, well, in terms of news and rumors, because I guess, now that we've talked about the draft lottery and all these potential playoff matchups, right? I mean, I guess, now we're kind of in, the we're kind of in the thick of it now. But, in terms of the news and rumors, I mean, Jake Fisher, he mentioned, a number of different things, right? Kind of what we've talked about, right? Like in terms of the offseason, in terms of what some of these teams did. He did mention that there's no Giannis trade talks as of yet. So there's still a decent level of skepticism that he's going to ask out. Of course, we don't know, right? Because there's still a lot of time left. But do you expect Giannis to ask out, or do you think he actually does kind of just kick it in Milwaukee and, do, whatever they can with that team?
I would expect him to ask out. I think there's too many good opportunities for him elsewhere.
Mm-hmm.
Other teams have some great draft capital to use, assets, whatever the heck they want to throw at Milwaukee to pretty much make them feel good about moving on from Giannis. They got a championship with him, and I think it's time to start the rebuild because clearly, they just don't really have what it takes to build a competent roster around that guy.
Yeah. The thing that was kind of confusing was he mentioned that, but he also mentioned that like there was also anticipation that the Bucks could include the Pelicans or the Blazers as like a third team, right? And like the reason why is because they shipped out draft picks to those teams, so I guess they could get their pick back. Like I think one of them was from the holiday trade,
Mm-hmm.
right? That I think went to Milwaukee, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then I guess whatever picks that they gave up for Dame, right? Maybe they could get those back in a Giannis trade potentially. So I mean, the fact that that's kind of being discussed makes me feel like it's still probably likely, but of course, you're not going to just automatically bank on anything.
Yeah.
And then also, excuse me, reportedly, thank you, Masai Ujiri. The Hawks want him. Atlanta's got interest in trying to hire him as the president of basketball ops, right? Because I believe they fired Landry Fields, right? So they're kind of looking for some new guys to bring in. Has he done a good job with the Raptors as of late?
No, I completely no. I mean, like I liked the roster they put together when they won the title. Like that kind of came out of nowhere, but recently and really ever since then, I've been thoroughly disappointed in what he's really built going on over there. Like what they have like four wings that just don't really make a whole lot of sense together, right? Scotty Barnes,
Barnes,
RJ Barrett,
Ingram,
Ingram.
Barrett,
Like, what are we doing? Are we really gonna put all that money into a roster that
Brady,
probably
quickly,
won't
I
do?
guess, are guards.
Yeah, but are you really going to put all that money into a roster that doesn't work? I mean, I
Mhm.
think anybody with two eyes can tell that that roster's not going to work. So I expect them to do something at the deadline, but maybe he can somehow get out of there before the ship blows up.
Yeah. Also, according to the Athletic, from Jay King, Drew Holiday could draw trade interest from contenders if Celtics shop star. So I guess the question is, obviously at this point he's not quite the same player anymore, but he still could probably be a team that could help a team outside of Boston. He's got a very specific role. Are there specific teams that you're thinking of that you would like to see him on that you think he could help?
Um, Milwaukee. I don't know. I'm just messing around. I'm just messing around, but
That's fun. Yeah,
I don't really know. I mean, I feel like
it's tough
he's
to
going to be an
decide.
addition. Yeah, he would be a great addition to, in terms of what he brings on both ends of the floor to pretty much, any contending team. It's just the problem is money wise, how is that realistically going to work, right? I feel like you're going to have to give somebody up, and who's willing to really do that for that kind of money.
Right, so that's the question, So because I don't think you're not gonna like if you're Boston, you're not getting back what you gave up to get him.
Mhm.
At this point,
Mhm.
he doesn't have the same value. But like you said, clearly I think teams would want him because he can still, I think, impact a team. Just not probably in, obviously, just like he did in Boston, right? Not in as big of a role as he had in Milwaukee, right? Like you probably want him more as like another supporting piece as opposed to like, a featured piece, right? Because like in
Yeah.
Milwaukee, he was their point guard, right? You probably would, but again, how many teams can have him be in the role that he was in Boston, right? Because you'd have to have other guys who can kind of handle the ball that probably aren't as much of backcourt guys, which there are teams that can do that. I mean, he can fit in anywhere, but I'm just saying.
Right.
Yeah. So, and now, last but not least, we're gonna just kind of reference. We did have a comment to read from from our last short. It was from back when the Thunder tied the series at 2 apiece when they were down 2-1, and the comment said it shouldn't even be 3-2. Because this, I think they commented after the Thunder won Game 5. They're acting like the Cavs, in my opinion, but they're still number this year. Somehow, I wouldn't be surprised if they lose next round or to the Nuggets. So, I mean, they're in the spot where they could potentially lose to the Nuggets. So, this is from TBITW1. So they are somewhat on the money, right? Like, I mean, they could definitely lose potentially in this game 7. We're not picking them to lose, right? But even in the next round, right? Like, I don't know if I would feel I don't feel like they're as dominant as I think as what we saw in the regular season. That doesn't mean that they can't win the title, though.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, the guy hit it pretty much on the money, realistically, talent-wise. It shouldn't be this close of a series, but you do have to shout out the Nuggets and what they've been able to accomplish, I feel like, throughout this series as well, and kind of taking Oklahoma City off their game.
Yeah, exactly. And then our last poll that we ended up doing, it was will OKC beat the Denver Nuggets? And in terms of the responses, right, we had 67% say yes. So we will see on Sunday if that comes true, and obviously we'll be recording, after that episode and kind of reacting to that game anyways, right? Because regardless of who wins, the series will be done.
Yep.
So it looks like most people still think that OKC will win.
Yeah.
Well, that's it for today's episode of Off Ball Takes. Again, let us know your thoughts on all these playoff series as we get to the conference finals, as we get towards the end of the NBA playoffs. Let us know your thoughts on the draft lottery, right? Do you think it was rigged? Are you stunned? Are you disappointed? Are you happy about the results? If you're a team that was in the lottery, are you thrilled by what you saw? And then obviously, what do you think of potentially what some of these teams could do in the offseason? Let us know. Again, as we normally say at the end of every episode, we always do polls on IG. So feel free to kind of, check in and respond, and we'll read the results at the end of our episode. Also, leave comments on our videos, and we'll read those at the end of the episode, just like we did, and continue to like and subscribe to help the channel grow. We recently got past, our goal of 200 subscribers. We're trying to get to 500. We're trying to get to 1,000. So please help us get closer to that goal, and you can do that, like I said, by continuing to subscribe. We appreciate all the support. We'll see you next episode.